There are certain things in life that we should stop and reconsider before we actually do them. These are usually called red flags. And one red flag that should be really important to all of us is when multitudes of people in our life tell us that what we're about to do or what we are doing is a really bad idea. They do not approve. Because most of the time, when a person does not listen to this wise advice, it usually does not go well for them, just like everyone said it wouldn't. Well, God is always right. Failing to listen to God will cause us unbelievable pain and agony. Failing to listen to God will affect every area of our lives, our marriages, our families, our relationships, our ministries, our work, our communities. In other words, it will not go well for us if we know what God is saying and we choose to not listen. Well, the nation of Israel found themselves in terrible trouble when they failed to listen to the prophet Jeremiah, and it cost them greatly. It cost them their great city, people's lives, and 70 years of captivity. In today's story in Daniel, the failure to listen to God will impact another person, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Like Israel, he was warned, and also like Israel, he chose to not listen. Today, we will cover chapters 3 and 4 of Daniel. Let's get started. Chapter 2 of Daniel concluded with Nebuchadnezzar's eyes opened up to Daniel's God, the one true God. After Daniel successfully interpreted his dream, Nebuchadnezzar says this in Daniel 2:47. Truly, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret. And then Nebuchadnezzar promoted Daniel to a high position and gave him many gifts. And then Daniel asked that his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also be promoted. And Nebuchadnezzar honored that. Now, 20 years later, we come to chapter 3. A lot can happen in 20 years. We really don't know if Nebuchadnezzar was even impacted or changed at all with his encounter with Daniel's God. But it seems that by the time we come to chapter 3, he's back to his old prideful self. This reminds me that generational things or lifelong habits and beliefs are really hard to break. Nebuchadnezzar had grown up in a culture where they worshiped multiple gods. So the practices and the beliefs that he grew up with were surely ingrained in him. And so worshiping only one God was not something that was even a part of who he was. It's important to note that during those 20 years, Daniel and his friends faithfully served both God and Babylon. It's also important to note that God is not finished with Nebuchadnezzar yet, which will become part of our storyline in chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 opens with a startling scene. Nebuchadnezzar builds a statue, a huge statue, 90 feet tall, which would have been about 9 stories high. And while the Bible says that it was made out of gold, scholars believe that the structure was actually made from wood but overlaid with gold. Either way, it was an impressive sight. I mean, idols are impressive, right? People serve idols because they're alluring, beautiful, and captivating. We don't know why Nebuchadnezzar built this statue, but what we do know is that 20 years prior to this, Daniel had predicted Nebuchadnezzar's losses. He would lose his position, his power, and his empire. So maybe by building this statue, it was one last attempt to try to keep this prophecy from being fulfilled. If the whole world worships his image, maybe this will be his opportunity to maintain his throne. I mean, this is just really a thought or a speculation. The image was set up on the plain of Dura, about 6 miles outside Babylon. And then Nebuchadnezzar set a day and a time for the unveiling, a dedication ceremony, so to speak. We read in Daniel 3:2, then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. every notable person in all of Babylon was invited. There were probably thousands that had gathered for this dedication ceremony. After the people arrived and they saw this mammoth statue, we read in Daniel 3, 4-6, then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." And they knew that he meant what he said. Then the music sounded, and at that sound, everyone bowed to the image. Everyone except for 3 Jewish men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why Daniel wasn't there, we don't know. But if he had been, there would have been 4 standing, not just 3. These 3 were fully devoted to their God and to his commands, most specifically the first command, "You shall have no other gods before me." So bowing to this image would have been like throwing a fist defiantly up in God's face. If only every believer could understand and know the seriousness of God's word, if only every believer would understand the implications to bowing to idols. It didn't take long before they were ratted out. Satan was right there in their midst, using people as pawns. Some astrologers went to Nebuchadnezzar to remind him of his edict. "Did you not say that at the sound of the music that everyone was to bow to your statue?" "I did say that, yes." "Well, there are 3 that have defied the king's edict, 3 that hold prominent positions. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have refused to bow." It says that King Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage, and he ordered that these Jewish men be brought to him. And he asked them if the charges were correct that they were bringing against them. And he said, you know what, I'm just going to give you one more chance to make it right. But they just stood there, said nothing. He must have liked them, because I don't think he would have given anybody else a second chance. And then he reminded them of the seriousness of their crime, a fiery death. And that's when they responded with these words in Daniel 3:16-18. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Well, the king's pride was hurt, and he became even more furious and demanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than it already was. And then he commanded his men to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. And the furnace was so hot that the men that carried them were actually killed along the way. Then what happens next is nothing less than miraculous. In fact, this has become one of the most popular miracles in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar jumps up from his seat, and as he looks into the fire, and he sees 4 men walking and unbound. "Did we not put 3 men in that fire?" "Yes, we did, sir." "Well, I see 4 men, and the 4th looks like a god." This is what we call a Christophany, an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. Imagine that. Then Nebuchadnezzar got as close to the furnace doors as he possibly could, and he called out, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out." And then to everyone's amazement, they walked out untouched by the fire and not even smelling like smoke. This is the second time that Nebuchadnezzar is confronted with the God of Israel. So he sends a message out, a decree out, saying that anyone in all of Babylon who speaks against the God of Israel will be killed. And then he promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions. Here's the thing. You can see God in action. You can see his miracles. You can hear what God has done in others' lives. But without surrender, nothing changes. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar has not surrendered his life to the God who's been running really hard after him. As we approach chapter 4, about 25 to 35 years have transpired since the fiery furnace miracle. It's also important to note that at the conclusion of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar goes into oblivion. He leaves the world stage as ruler of the Babylonian Empire. But what's really great about God is that God will keep running after us even when we keep running away. Chapter 4 actually begins with Nebuchadnezzar's testimony on how God kept running after him and what God did to finally get his attention. And then he sends a message throughout the world. And it says this in Daniel 4, 2-3. I want you all to know about the miraculous signs and wonders the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how powerful his wonders. His kingdom will last forever, his rule through all generations. This is what true transformation looks like. A pagan king, a ruthless king, who for most of his reign had ruled on the throne of his own heart, has now bowed to the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Of course, we don't have any more information, and so we aren't quite certain if this is really surrender, but it certainly seems like it is. That's how chapter 4 begins. But Nebuchadnezzar goes on in chapter 4 to tell us exactly what happened to him to bring him to this place of surrender, and it's not pleasant. Remember, we talked about the consequences that we'll have to face if we fail to listen to God. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to tell us exactly what happened to him. He began to have dreams again. And like before, they were very disturbing. Also, like before, he sought out the wise men of Babylon to see if they could interpret these dreams for him. But as before, they couldn't do it. He says, then Daniel walked in. And he said to Daniel in Daniel 4:9, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too great for you to solve. Now tell me what my dream means. Nebuchadnezzar saw in Daniel what we would call a spirit-filled believer. He recognized the favor of Daniel's God upon him. So Nebuchadnezzar begins to tell Daniel the dream, and he says it's about a large tree. The tree grew very strong, reaching high into the heavens. It was a luscious tree, full of fruit. This tree fed the entire world. Then a messenger came with a message: cut the tree down, lop off its branches, and scatter the fruit. But leave the stump and the roots in the ground. Let the tree be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let it live with the wild animals. For 7 periods of time, let him have the mind of a wild animal until he and everyone knows that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the earth. Nebuchadnezzar stops, looks at Daniel, and he says, that's my dream. Now tell me the interpretation. It seems that God had given the interpretation to Daniel immediately, but Daniel hesitated to give the meaning to Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe they had become friends. Probably they had become friends. And he saw that this dream predicted a horrible path for Nebuchadnezzar. And he says, I wish this for your enemies, not you, my Lord. But Nebuchadnezzar told him to interpret it anyways. Daniel continues. He says in Daniel 4:22, the tree, your majesty, is you. For you have grown strong and great. Your greatness reaches up to heaven, and your rule to the ends of the earth. And then Daniel continues, and he says, basically, Nebuchadnezzar, this dream is predicting your demise. You're going to be taken from your throne. You're going to be dethroned, and you're going to end up living like a wild animal with the mind of a wild animal for 7 periods of time. Scholars say that that's 7 years. So for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar, you're literally going to be crazy. But the stump and the roots remain in the ground, which predicts that the kingdom will be returned to you, but not until you have learned that heaven rules. Daniel was heartbroken. So he says to King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:27, King Nebuchadnezzar, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. In other words, if you do these things, Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps God will have mercy on you. But he failed to listen, and God did exactly as he said he would do. A year later, when Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his palace overlooking Babylon and admiring all the things that he had done and accomplished, he was literally driven from that place, and he ended up living like a wild animal. We read in Daniel 4:33, he lived this way until his hair was as long as eagle's feathers and his nails were like birds' claws. Imagine the sight of this man when people saw him, a man who at one time was clothed with the royal robes of a king and with a crown on his head, to a man who didn't even look human. We read in Daniel 4:34, after this time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven. My sanity returned, and I praised and worshiped the Most High and honored the one who lives forever. And then he said in Daniel 4:36, when my sanity returned to me, so did my honor and glory and kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored as head of my kingdom with even greater honor than before, and he gave praise and honor to the one true God. At the conclusion of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar disappears from the world stage. God had run hard after this man until he finally saw what he had missed for so many years. I kind of wonder if Nebuchadnezzar had listened to Daniel's wise advice, if he would have been spared those 7 years of living like a wild animal. We can only hope, right? We're not sure if this is a true surrendered life or not, but it certainly appears that way. In fact, many scholars believe that we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I agree. That's the storyline from Daniel 3-4. Now let's close with some practical principles that we might gain from this story. Here are 4. 1, idolatry is dangerous. It's dangerous. God hates idolatry, always has. Why? Because when we worship anything else, we push God off the throne of our hearts. And God is a jealous God, and he wants our wholehearted devotion. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood this, and they refused to bow to another god, even though their lives were threatened. Idolatry leads us away from God and into sin. So we must evaluate if there's anything else at the center of our hearts, like people, religion, church, ministry, work, entertainment, etc., etc. And if there is, then get rid of it, because there's only one God that we should ever really bow to. And when God is at the center of our hearts, his favor will be poured out on us. 2, always stand on truth. Always stand on truth. Daniel and his friends knew what the law of God was, and so they vowed to not dishonor God by bowing to the culture or the practices of the Babylonians. It cost them for sure, but in the end, God was the one glorified. Never compromise truth because everyone else is doing it. These 4 Jewish men show us that it is possible to always stand on truth, even if you're all alone, it's uncomfortable, or the pressures are mounting. Imagine the rewards of those who are always standing on truth. 3, God may not deliver you from the fire, but he does promise you that he will be with you in the midst of it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's story reveal that everything God does is for a greater purpose, including the fires that we may go through. God may not deliver you from the fire because he wants to reveal his character or the gospel to someone, or maybe he wants to teach you to trust more or to grow your faith. It's really awesome when God does deliver us from the fire, and those happen sometimes, but I think it's even better when we can experience his presence in the midst of it. And 4, surrendering to God is really what transforms us. Nebuchadnezzar's story reminds us of that. He had heard great things, he had seen miracles, but it wasn't until he acknowledged the one true God and he bowed to him that his life was really transformed. You know, we can go to church every Sunday, know our Bibles pretty well, serve in ministry, and still not have been transformed by the grace of God. It's when we look up, when we offer our bodies to Him as a sacrifice, when we accept His will for our life no matter what, when we say, Lord, I follow you, and then we live it out. That's when true transformation really takes place in our lives. I've been transformed. Have you? What an incredible blessing it's been to study Daniel. Hang with me because it's only going to get better.